Well, I think we'll get started. You need your microphone. Yeah. And we need to work these pretty close. We're live on C-SPAN, in addition to our audience here at Riggs Library in Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I'm Sanford Ungar, the director of the Free Speech Project, and we're really honored to have Jamie Raskin with us this morning. We've been working on these plans for a long time, and we're thrilled that we could bring them together at a particularly apt moment. Just a few words of introduction. Jamie is one of the few congressmen whose district is actually on the D.C. border, if I'm not mistaken.
I think I live closer to the Capitol than any other member of Congress.
Right, there you
except
go.
for the disenfranchised Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Right.
And she lives like 3 blocks away from the Capitol.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Jamie Raskin represents Maryland's 8th congressional district since 2017. And he has a rich background of qualification for doing that, including that he was constitutional law professor at American University and served for several years in the Maryland State Senate. As it happens, I've known Jamie and his family for quite a long time. I knew both your parents. I don't know if you realize that, in the 60s, in the anti-war period, and wrote a book about the Pentagon Papers, and your father was very involved with the effort to get the Pentagon Papers made public. So you have a great lineage, Jamie. He was a law professor at American University and then a Maryland State Senator, and in 2017 moved into Congress. He was the lead impeachment manager in the second Senate trial of Donald Trump. These things, it takes a lot of words. There's so many proceedings.
So many trials.
That's right.
Yes.
And and a member of the Select Committee on the January 6th attack on the Capitol. I think my favorite current relevant fact about Jamie is that in 2022, just 2 years ago, he was banned at the same, a book of his was banned at the same time in Texas, and he was banned in the same week by Vladimir Putin he was banned for life from Russia for his pro-Ukrainian activities. So his book, We the Students, can't be read in Texas, and he can't go to Russia. But he's making.
But I'm making it at Georgetown University.
That's right.
So, yeah.
Here you are.
Yeah.
Well, Jamie, there's a bunch of stuff we want to do in the next hour, but I want to start with this sort of recent big picture. I mean, this is a very timely week for us to be talking. How you assess the state of the presidential campaign after this debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump? There's been so much ink spilled this week about from experts of every stripe. I'm interested in knowing what you think.
Well, I think it's been completely exhilarating ever since President Biden made his heroic decision to pass the baton to Kamala Harris, and he's demonstrated to everybody what real leaders do. Real leaders make room for other leaders. In addition to their other actions, they consider that an important part of their role in history. So I've been to 26 states now, Sandy, and thank you for having me and to introduce me to these wonderful Georgetown students. And but I've been to 26 states, and the feeling is remarkable out there. I mean, the wind is at our back. I think that my former colleague in the House, our vice presidential running mate, Tim Walz, captured it well when he said, well, it's the fourth quarter when we're behind by 3, but we got the ball and we got the momentum and we're moving down the field. And everywhere I go, there's just tremendous action and expression and creativity and humor and youthful exuberance about this campaign and what's happening right now. And Donald Trump, to my mind, I don't mean to sound too partisan, but he looks increasingly bedraggled and besieged and old and obsolete and out of touch.
His
Other than that, it's a fair fight. You know.
his performance in the debate the other night has been talked about and a great deal.
These guys spent more time getting ready for this conversation than he spent getting ready for the debate, I think.
I think
You
that's
know, I
probably
mean,
true.
there was no preparation. And of course, there's nothing to prepare for in his case because there's no program for the country. There's no agenda. You know, the political scientists have told us what the hallmark characteristics are of an authoritarian or fascist political party or tendency. One, they don't accept the outcome of democratic elections that don't go their way. Two, they embrace or they refuse to disavow political violence as an instrument for obtaining and maintaining political power. Three, they're organized as an authoritarian cult of personality around a charismatic or allegedly charismatic figure. And then four, because they have no real plans for the people that they're willing to submit to the people for debate and discussion, they thrive on scapegoating, racism, anti-Semitism, gay bashing, immigrant bashing, and so on. And, you know, they got mad at our great President Joe Biden when he said there were semi-fascist currents running through the Republican Party. But I'm sorry, if the shoe semi-fits, you semi-wear it. That's what they've become. They've taken Lincoln's party of freedom and union, anti-know-nothing, anti-conspiracy theory, anti what we would call today propaganda and disinformation and lies, and they've turned it into this cult of lying.
So that actually leads me to my next question. How do you explain the fact that there's still, people say, 70 million, 80 million followers of Donald Trump in this country? After he's been president for 4 years, he's hasn't changed his demeanor and his manner very much since that time, and still holds on to tens of millions of followers.
Well, the vast majority of the country still rejects authoritarianism and that kind of derangement, I think. The vast majority of the country is pro-choice, it's pro-environment, it's pro-labor, it's pro-freedom, and it's pro-democracy. There's an interesting book out now by the historian H.W. Brands about the American Revolution called The First Civil War. And it's about how it divided the country down the middle between the patriots for the American cause and the loyalists to the crown. And then we saw the same thing in the Civil War, where you had a majority of the people standing up for the Union, for the Constitution, for freedom, and that you still had people who were secessionists and insurrectionists and wanted to uphold slavery as the principal value against the Constitution and against the Union. So, we're talking about an historical struggle for democracy and freedom, and it doesn't surprise me that there are people who've fallen for that, although there are more and more people who are breaking away from it. I mean, look at my friend Liz Cheney, who, to my mind, is a great constitutional patriot. She was the head of the Republican conference in the House of Representatives, and she could have had, whatever she wanted within the Republican Party and Republican administrations, but she would not stand for violent and conspiratorial assaults against the Constitution and attempts to supplant an election with a political coup. And now, we've got a big tent at this point. Dick Cheney's in our tent at this point, supporting Kamala Harris and Tim Walz and, Adam and Mitt Romney. There's a lot of the Republicans who just cannot stomach this kind of authoritarianism. So, yeah, that's the story of what's going on Earth today. We've got autocrats and kleptocrats and plutocrats and dictators in control of a lot of governments around the world. That's Putin in Russia, it's Orban in Hungary, it's Xi in China, Donald Trump's Valentine, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, it's El-Sisi in Egypt. You look and see. The founders of America knew that democratic freedom under a constitutional government was the exception and would be the exception. Most people have lived for most of human history under dictators and madmen, people like Putin and Trump and Orban. That's been the fate of humanity. The extraordinary thing about America is that the people have insisted on a different direction. The idea that the people would rule, and we would rule with freedoms and rights, beginning with the First Amendment, the dramatic separation of church and state, and the empowerment of people to speak their minds on their own behalf. And that is very closely connected to having a democracy. There is no democracy without freedom, but there's also no freedom without democracy. Lincoln understood that really well. He said that somebody said, well, what's the connection between the Declaration of Independence and its values of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the consent of the governed, and the Constitution, right? And he said, well, the Constitution, constitutional democracy is like the beautiful silver frame upon which rests the golden apple of freedom. In other words, we're not going to have freedom without democracy. It doesn't guarantee it. Even within democracy, you got to fight for your freedom. But Vladimir Putin and the autocrats are not going to defend anybody's freedom, anybody's liberty. The dictators will always trample your freedom.
Jamie, just for a second, I'd like to dissect and take, I guess, seriously some of the things that Trump and now Vance have said, for example, about immigration. And Donald Trump boasts about potentially the largest deportation in history, and they use many different numbers. The highest one I've heard is 18 million people.
Well, he also said this week billions of people.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But
we're going to deport more people than who live in the country.
Right.
Yeah. So.
But even if one for a moment takes it seriously, which I'm not certain one can, a program to deport 18 million people, when you compare, it's much bigger in a way than what happened in Nazi Germany. It's a huge potential project, and what this country would be like if they, first of all, could they do this? Do we have to worry about this? Is it feasible? And what would this country turn into in the course of that? I mean, camps would have to be built. What would be the infrastructure?
I mean, I would take that and the rest of Project 2025, the MAGA manifesto, very seriously. I think that his anti-immigrant team is very powerful within his inner circle. We know that they started with the Muslim ban when he got elected, and that's what led to the airport protests all over the country. And I think that does give you a little glimpse, a little foreshadowing of what it would look like. Of course, it's small potatoes compared to deporting millions of people. And he's talking about having roundups in internment camps and kicking people out of the country. At a moment, by the way, when we have chronic labor shortages, and I have people coming to my office from the hotel industry, the retail industry, the restaurant industry, the Eastern Shore farmers. We need workers, we need labor, and they're talking about deporting 18 million people from the country and creating a reign of terror, which of course is the real object, to create a sense of chaos and fear in the public. But again, like that idea, as outlandish and as extreme as it sounds, has roots in American history. The Alien and Sedition Acts created an atmosphere like that at the beginning of the Republic. So, I mean, Trump's no fool. He understands that there is an audience for the things that he's saying. I mean, even just the comically sensational, fabricated things he's saying, like there are people in Ohio eating cats and dogs right now who've come over from Haiti. By the way, I've spoken to Haitian friends who say it's just such a slander on the Haitian American community, and people are very upset about what he's saying.
I'm sure they are.
Yeah.
I'd like to step back a little bit. You've attained quite a lot of influence in a relatively short period of time in Congress, and chair of the House, or ranking member, I should say, perhaps soon chair of the House Committee on Oversight, and some of the other roles we've had. And because we have a lot of students here today, and a lot of Georgetown students are interested in being in government and would look at you as a role model. I wonder if you could talk for a moment about your time in the Maryland state legislature, where I saw you often because I was working in Maryland at the time. And
You're a college president.
I was.
Yeah.
Um, and you built, I mean, Maryland. You built that role in Maryland into quite a forceful thing. And so, what about this role of state legislatures as a place to sort of train for serious national political influence? There's so many state legislatures in this country that are dysfunctional right now.
Well, I would recommend it highly, although I wouldn't think of it necessarily as just a way station to Congress, because, I mean, the truth is, legislatively, I was able to get a lot more done at the state level than I've been able to so far at the federal level because of the dysfunction between the parties. And
what were some of the things you're proud of that you accomplished in Maryland?
All right, I don't want to sound like I'm bragging, but
well, I'm inviting you to.
I was the majority whip of the Maryland Senate. We passed marriage equality in Maryland a year before the Obergefell decision was decided by the Supreme Court. It was, in fact, cited by the Supreme Court. I went down to see the Obergefell decision being argued, and I saw Mr. Obergefell in the hallway afterwards talking to media, and they asked how he felt, and he said he felt great and amazing about where they were, but he wanted to thank the people of Maryland for taking a stand, because he married his husband in Maryland on the tarmac and on the runway. So that was an amazing thing. We were the first state in the union to uphold marriage equality at the polls, because the Republicans petitioned it to a referendum, and everybody thought you couldn't get a majority of the people behind it, but we did, and we were the first ones to do it. Although, in fairness, that's only because the polls closed 1 hour earlier in Maryland than they did in Maine, because the same thing happened there too. But it began a trend, and now, of course, it's overwhelmingly popular. I mean, these young people probably can't even imagine what it was like to live at a time when gay people couldn't couldn't marry the people that they loved, or couldn't love the people that they married. Yeah.
That's a different subject.
That's a different problem. Yeah. So we did that. We abolished the death penalty in Maryland after having it for 4 centuries before Maryland even became a state. As a colony, there was the death penalty. I remember I was the floor leader on that, and I got up and I gave people a history of capital punishment in our state. The first cases I could find were execution of runaway slaves, execution of insubordinate indentured servants. There were hanging of witches. It wasn't just in New England. It took place in some of the mid-Atlantic states too. But the critical thing was we had a 5th or 6th generation Marylander who was on death row, who was exonerated. Kirk Bloodsworth is his name. I don't know if you ever read the book about it called Bloodsworth. He was convicted of the most gruesome, grisly rape and murder of an 11 or 12-year-old girl, and he hadn't done it. And the FBI composite portrait looked exactly like him. The psychological profile fit him to a T. He swore he hadn't done it. The first trial ended up as a mistrial. He was tried again. He was convicted. He was on death row for several years, and then DNA evidence was created. And just through just sheer fortuity, just pure good luck, the physical specimens were still available. The judge's secretary in the case never believed that he was guilty and had saved it. And when the DNA evidence, the DNA tests were refined and perfected, they did the DNA test, and it was not him. And they found the guy who was actually the rapist murderer in prison at the same time, like 2 floors above him, in prison. And he was exonerated and he was freed. So, I made a speech. I said to my Republican friends, the capital punishment's a great system for people who think the government is perfect and infallible and it doesn't make mistakes, which is not what we usually heard from our friends across the aisle. Usually they said the government can't do anything, can't get everything right. But then in the context of the death penalty, they assumed that the government would not make any mistakes, which isn't right. And we ended up on a bipartisan basis abolishing the death penalty after 4 centuries. So, we passed a medical marijuana program that I introduced. We decriminalized marijuana in the state. We passed the nation's first national popular vote interstate compact. We initiated that. We're now more than 2/3 of the way there because it's 2024. How about it's time we start electing the president the way we elect mayors and representatives and senators and governors? Whoever gets the most votes wins, right? Rather than a convoluted, antique, obsolete system from the 18th century, which these days can get you killed, as nearly it did on January the 6th,
Right.
2021. I mean, we were meeting there just because of the formalities of the 12th Amendment, which say that you've got to have a joint session to count the Electoral College votes sent in by the governors under the certificates of ascertainment. But we knew who had won the election. Everybody knew who had won the election, but we're still going through these 18th century rituals, and that's what gave Donald Trump the opportunity to convoke the mob, come here, we'll be wild, and then tell them to go and fight like hell, or they wouldn't have a country anymore. So look, we've had 5 popular vote losers in American history become president twice in this century alone, in 2000 and 2016. And I think the vast majority of the American people think we should be electing the president just by having an election and seeing who gets the most votes, rather than this convoluted, rickety system where it all comes down to a handful of states, 6 or 7 states, instead of everybody's vote counting equally everywhere in the country.
So what do you predict? We'll switch back to the national scene that's so much on our minds at the moment. What do you predict will happen if Donald Trump loses the election again, both popular and electoral vote, and perhaps by more electoral votes than the last time, perhaps not because of the convoluted system, but enough swing states make a difference? Will he the way I read what he said during the debate the other night, he avoided saying that he would respect the results of the eletion next time.
He avowedly did not say that he would respect the results of the election.
Right.
It's just like last time, he'll wait to see what happens
Right.
before he determines it. Again, that's a hallmark sign of a fascist political party. I don't accept the possibility that I might lose.
Right.
Right? And I mean, 3rd graders understand that. Kindergartners understand that. Like, you may win, you may lose, but you accept the outcome. And he's not gotten to that level of the Piaget moral and emotional development scale yet, where he could accept that he might actually lose the election. And he refuses to accept that he lost in 2020, despite the fact he lost by more than 7 million votes, 306 to 232 in the Electoral College, and 60 federal and state courts, presided over, including by 8 people he named to the bench, rejected every single claim of electoral fraud and corruption he asserted. So it's not like this is some sort of contested, debatable thing.
So
it's just a matter of fact. He lost the election.
Has he learned a lesson, but he just wants to keep that a secret, or he harbors plans to do something about it if he loses again next time? And what?
Yeah, I don't think he's running a real political campaign. Again, I've been out in all parts of the country. I'm seeing Democrats everywhere knocking on doors, canvassing, rallying, putting up signs, bumper stickers, the whole thing. I'm seeing very little of that on the other side, but instead I hear Donald Trump saying, we can't lose. This is going to be the biggest fraud since 2020, and he's preparing people to try to get it into the courts. And his dream is that if it can come down to one state and he can create some triable issue, that it'll go up to the Supreme Court, where his gerrymandered and packed and stacked Supreme Court that he designed to overthrow Roe versus Wade will be there also to instate him into office. Like that's basically his vision. And so what was January 6, 2021 about? I mean, a lot of different things, but ultimately it was a certification contest. It was an attempt to get Congress not to certify the electoral votes that had come in from the states and not to count them. They're going to do the same thing this time, starting at the precinct level, the county level, the state level. They want to try to throw the whole country into chaos and bedlam. Check out the front page of today's Washington Post about what they're doing, because they're very nervous about the abortion amendments that are on the ballot in a lot of different states, and they're trying to just nullify the amendments if they can, kick them off of the ballot or somehow obstruct them, also to blockade people from registering to vote and so on. But it all comes down to creating impediments to the democratic will.
Depending what you read and where you read it, there are cells of people ready to come out of the woodwork and defend Trump, assault the other side on behalf of Trump, that we have and we don't know who they are or where they are. Do you see something like that? Do you see him able to tie the country in knots for days, weeks, months after the election?
On the Democratic side, we understand it's a two-part task right now. One, we got to win the election. Two, we got to defend the election. Okay. I don't know exactly what's going on the other side. They've been through a whole bunch of campaign managers, and there's constant tumult and turnover and chaos the way there is around Donald Trump. And so it's hard to project or predict what it is they want to do. But I know that he has a gut instinct to try to get this before the Supreme Court, because that's a court, as we saw in the presidential immunity decision, which has clearly elevated Trump's monarchical ambitions above any original understanding of the Constitution.
How do you explain that? I mean, as a law teacher for many years, as a constitutional lawyer, how do you explain that the Supreme Court could be so bent in such a direction?
Well, you got to do a seminar, Sandy, about the Federalist Society and the multi-decade plan to take over the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary. But it's also got to be said that the Supreme Court has been a very reactionary institution for most of American history, right? I mean, what did the Supreme Court ever do for enslaved people in our country?
Not much.
Nothing. I mean, in the Dred Scott decision in 1857, the Supreme Court cemented the system of slavery into place, saying that that Africans and their descendants had no rights the white man was bound to respect, and that the whole Constitution was the white man's compact. Then even after the Civil War, which was meant to overthrow the slave masters and to emancipate millions of enslaved people, the Supreme Court as late as Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 constitutionalized Jim Crow apartheid in America, separate but equal. And so the Supreme Court today still has a faint fading halo around it from the Warren Court era, where you did get Brown versus Board of Education, Miranda versus Arizona, the white primary cases, Roe versus Wade carried over a little bit into the Burger Court period, I think in 73. But it was basically a 2 or 3 decade period where the Supreme Court, you could say, really was on the side of the freedoms and rights of the people. But for most of its history, the court has been very backward, and it has retreated to that historical baseline after the Warren Court with the Burger Court, the Rehnquist Court, the Roberts Court. And we see what they've been doing. I mean, they've dismantled the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Holder. They overturned women's right to choose, a fundamental right the Supreme Court had declared, which existed for more than 50 years in the country. And despite what they testified they would do in terms of respecting precedent, they just threw that out the window. They just elevated the president above the rest of the country, saying that he or she would not be subject to criminal prosecution for actual felony crimes committed, as long as it was in the course of their acting as president of the United States within a core function. Then they exposing the fact that they're not remotely textualists, they completely disappeared the text of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which says that if you've sworn an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic, and you violate it by engaging in insurrection or rebellion, you shall never be allowed to hold federal or state office again. And they just obliterated that provision. So they're not textualists, they're not originalists, they're acting like a bunch of tawdry partisans, and also ones who are feathering their own nests, right? Justice Thomas has collected more than $4 million from his billionaire sugar daddy, Harlan Crow.
I have two more questions on this, not to stay on it too long, but first is, as somebody who's studied and taught and lived this, what do you imagine actually happens in that Supreme Court conference room? I mean, do they go in and say, okay, guys, how do we fix this one? Or how do we, as you describe it, it's really a pretty sinister process.
Well, I think most of the Supreme Court has abandoned, a Warren Court sensibility. It's not like Justice Thurgood Marshall or Justice William Brennan. I think they do have their heirs and descendants on the court today, but it really is a 6-3 court.
Isn't Roberts embarrassed by what they're doing?
I think he has, some institutionalist values that make him embarrassed about what's happened. But President Biden has advanced the right agenda. Look, we've got the highest court in the land with the lowest ethical standards in the whole country, right? It's the only court in America that doesn't have a binding ethics code on it. So how do you have justices who are running away with millions of dollars in private contributions, paying off family members' tuition, paying off family members' mortgages? Justice Thomas got a recreational vehicle with a dining room in it and a kitchen and a bedroom, and that started as a loan that just became a gift. That's scandalous. In Congress, we have a $50 gift ban, and we don't even go anywhere near that. It doesn't make any sense. We don't touch it. AOC and I have legislation to apply the $50 gift ban, which exists for Congress and the executive branch, to the Supreme Court. Right? They make double the amount of money members of Congress do. They can pay for their own vacations.
How's that going? How many co-sponsors?
We've got a lot. Unfortunately, like everything else, it's totally partisan. You would think that Republicans would join in, but
what would be a meaningful fix for the Supreme Court?
So we need a binding ethics code with some body, perhaps made up of federal circuit court judges, who could actually examine claims of conflicts of interest as they apply to particular justices. We don't have that. If you think there's a problem with something Justice Alito is doing, you have to complain to Justice Alito, and then he will decide whether or not he is capable of being objective.
Or to the New York Times or the Washington Post or what have you, who are the real traffic cops about some of these things going on.
Well, if you read the New York Times or the Washington Post, but they're clearly justices who don't care.
Oh, I'm sure that's
true. About what they say.
Right.
Right. So we need an inspector general over there. President Biden has advanced the idea of 18-year terms. When the country started, the average life expectancy in America was early to mid 60s. Today, a Supreme Court justice could live to their 90s or their 100s. We could have Brett Kavanaugh on the court for 80 years or something like that. President Biden said, let's do 18-year terms, and it's consistent with the Constitution because which provides for life tenure during good behavior as long as they could go to be a federal district judge or a federal appeals court judge. But I would go beyond that. I think it's an emergency now with just these absolute atrocities of decisions that they're handing down. And I think, look, we've got 13 federal circuits in the United States. We've got 9 justices on the Supreme Court. That means 4 federal circuits are left out, no matter what, are not going to have somebody on the court. And in fact, today it's much worse than that. I think 9 circuits are left out. We got 5 justices who come from New York City. That's not an ideological partisan point. They're all over the map. But we've got 1 justice for each borough in New York City, okay? Manhattan and Queens and Staten Island. It just makes no sense. So how about we move the Supreme Court to 13 justices? We make sure that every justice, every federal circuit has at least one justice on the court or has one justice on the court. We move to 18-year terms. We allow each president to nominate 2 justices, so it's not such a polarized and political thing. We know that each president would get 2 with staggered terms. And we get out of this morass and quicksand that we're in with the Supreme Court having been captured by a tiny group of people around the Federalist Society and a bunch of billionaires who pull everybody's strings.
For those who don't follow this quite so closely, the federal circuits are geographically defined, plus the District of Columbia. So actually, this is a federalist spreading out of influence across the country. You could argue if you had.
I think we need to have that. I mean, because the bottleneck and kind of the closed control we have of the Supreme Court exists not just in ideological and partisan and political terms, but in sectional and geographic terms. Look, I've got a constituent you may have heard of named Merrick Garland, okay? And he's Attorney General of the United States. When he was the Chief Judge of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, he was nominated to the Supreme Court in February of 2016 by President Obama after the death of Justice Scalia. Now, Merrick Garland was one of the most qualified people ever nominated to the Supreme Court. He was the Chief Judge of the D.C. Circuit, arguably the most important circuit that does all of the administrative law cases, a lot of the constitutional...
And sends quite a few people to the Supreme Court over the time.
And Senator McConnell said, no, we're not going to have any hearings, much less a vote on it, because 10 and a half months is too close to the next election. We want to let the people decide. Of course, the people had decided when they elected Barack Obama to a verifiable 4-year term to President of the United States, right? So he said, no, that's too close to the election. Then, 4 years later, in September of 2020, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, now this was 2 months before the election, and early voting had started in a whole bunch of states. And the media said immediately to Senator McConnell, well, you're not going to have hearings and try to ram this through at the end, are you? He said, oh, of course we are. That was just for the Democrats, right? So we've got a Supreme Court that's fundamentally illegitimate. It's illegitimate in terms of the substance of its decisions. It's illegitimate in terms of the way a number of them got onto the Supreme Court. And I do think it's illegitimate in composition and design. And we should move to a 13-member Supreme Court where every federal circuit in every part of the country is represented.
So are they embarrassed how they got on the court? Are they embarrassed, or are they just triumphant that they took over the Supreme Court?
I'm very interested in your question. I don't know the answer, but I'll tell you this. There's a new documentary which I think is coming out maybe this week or next week about the confirmation process surrounding Brett Kavanaugh and what happened with people who tried to testify about the whole alleged sexual assault and so on.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see, what people think about that. And I mean, is Justice Alito embarrassed about the fact that they turned the American flag upside down and then displayed that in their front yard, or they displayed another MAGA symbol, the embrace of the Appeal to Heaven flag, which actually is an historical ripoff, because that was a perfectly honorable radical democratic flag against British monarchy, which they somehow adopted and turned into
it doesn't
a MAGA
sound
symbol.
subversive, an Appeal to Heaven.
Yeah, well, they think Appeal to Heaven means theocracy, but the phrase comes from John Locke, who was saying, we will appeal to heaven against the monarchs. And
a couple constitutional details or issues that I thought we might raise, given your background. It would appear from a lot of evidence that lies, outright lies, verifiable lies, lies that have been documented by various people and newspapers, other places, that lies are totally protected by the First Amendment.
The Supreme Court has said that political lies are protected by the First Amendment.
So,
and obviously that decision's had a lot of impact.
Yes, it has.
Yes.
But is this just sort of a flaw in the Bill of Rights?
No, I think it's necessary, and I am pretty Lockean and Millian, I suppose, about this. I mean, what is the best answer to?
I'm looking around for my students when you say million.
I meant John Stuart Mill.
Yes, I know.
Yeah. So,
we talk about John Stuart.
You guys still read Mill and
Oh, yes,
Locke?
we do. Yes, we do.
Good for you.
Let's
hear it for Georgetown.
But we certainly read Mill.
But look, the only answer to the profusion of lies that we get really is people figuring them out and answering them and debunking them. And what's joyful about this presidential campaign right now is people are having fun debunking all the lies about immigrants eating cats and dogs and all that kind of stuff. People have begun to turn it around and expose the outlandishness and the absurdity and the derangement of all of these lies. What's the alternative? The government is going to decide what's a lie and what's the truth? I don't think so. That's not going to work. So what solution do we have other than people telling the truth to debunk the lies? Now, what's interesting is that, Donald Trump has never been prosecuted for any of his lies about the 2020 election. But the lawyers for Donald Trump who go to court and either testify under oath or they act as officers of the court and they lie, they're getting punished for it because you can't lie in court. You are under oath or you're acting as an officer. So most of Donald Trump's lawyers have now been sanctioned. I mean, Rudy Giuliani has been, I think he's been suspended in New York, disbarred in the District of Columbia. As a lawyer, you have a professional responsibility not to lie. And the whole campaign against the 2020 election was built on lies. Like Giuliani said, well, we don't have any facts, but we have a lot of theories, which reminded me of what Trump said the other night when he said, well,
concepts.
9 years later, I don't have any plans, but I've got some ideas of concepts, of theories, of delusions of plans. We'll get there, So a real political party will promote actual plans to put before the public and say, debate them, weigh them, and let's try to move forward as a society.
A big subject, but I just want to light on it for a second. Section 230, absolute protection of social media from any responsibility for things that they publish, disseminate, that can be very mischievous and cause a lot of trouble.
Yes.
Would you change that in a?
Yeah, I think that Section 230 obviously helped to give life and give lift to the internet when it was getting started. They obviously don't need that huge infrastructural subsidy from the government anymore. At the very least, they should not be immunized for their own algorithmic liability. I mean, if you create algorithms that cause real problems, damages to people, you inflict torts on people, crimes happen because of it. That is something where the internet service providers are not acting just like a billboard, but they themselves are the speaker. And you do have to be responsible for your speech. And, as your students know, we have broad protection for political speech in America, perhaps broader than anywhere else in the world. But you don't have a right to commit slander and defamation. You don't have a right to incite imminent lawless action. And there are a lot of different things that you can do which do create legal liability, even if they're in the form of verbal or written expression.
I would think that'll be the next frontier in real fighting over free speech. I want to make sure we give a chance to some students in particular to raise questions. Brief questions, please, concise. Say who you are, where you're from, what you're studying, and we'll try to get some good questions out.
Hello?
It's on. Just speak into it. Hold it close to your mouth and speak into it.
Hello, my name is Bennett Gilhooly. I'm a freshman in the College of Arts and Sciences. And I was wondering how the Chevron case plays a role in the conversation we were just having about, from my understanding, it takes away the power of executive agencies to determine the language and how they go about, policies. And so how does that affect the future? And
So the question's about the Supreme Court's recent overruling of the Chevron decision. I would edit your characterization of the decision just a little bit. It doesn't take away the federal agency's power to interpret the meaning of the statute and to promulgate regulations, but it takes away its the presumption that it's right. And so now the court is saying, well, the federal agencies can interpret, but we the court will maintain the final power to determine, to divine what Congress's intent was. And so, like almost every other decision in this term, the presidential immunity decision, the decision in the Anderson v. Trump case, nullifying Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, it's all a power grab by the Supreme Court, saying, leave it to us. We will be the final arbiter of everything. I mean, the federal agencies must continue to interpret the statutes. Congress now has a burden to try to define with ever more specificity, as much as we can mobilize in a particular domain of regulation, what our intent is, because we know we've got a right-wing Supreme Court which is willing to just take the football and run with it all the way to the other end zone, completely divorced from congressional will. The conceit of that decision was somehow they were demonstrating fidelity to congressional intent. In fact, what they're saying is they want to usurp Congress's power, because we could always overrule the agencies. We could always amend the statutes or, pull the chain
We
back.
being Congress.
We, the Congress, could. But now the court is saying, no, they want to be the ones to be reviewing the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And we know specifically what they have in mind, like in the case of the Clean Air Act, where they said that the EPA does not have the power to regulate in the interests of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or it's done it in all these college student loan cases. I mean, they just invent doctrines on a daily basis. They have this new doctrine, the major questions doctrine, which is if an agency is acting within its authority, but the court interprets it to be a major question, whatever that is, then it will strike down what the agency has done. Where did that doctrine come from? The stork brought it, obviously, right? They just made it up. They pulled a rabbit out of the hat.
Another question. Stand up, please.
Hello, Congressman. My name is Sanjay. I'm from Seattle, Washington. First of all, I would like to say thank you. I was part of your Democracy Summer program.
Oh, good for you, Sanjay. That's great.
Yeah, so it was very helpful in helping me get to a college like this, so I just want to say thank you. Secondly, I'd like to talk about campaign finance. Campaign finance is a big thing. Supreme Court's decisions recently about free speech being money has led to a lot of, I'd say, illegitimate money being poured into presidential local campaigns. So I'd say, what change do you think needs to be made in campaign finance laws to help strengthen our democracy?
Great. First of all, Sanjay mentioned the Democracy Summer Project, which is a project that we have for high school and college students to come and spend the summer studying the history of democratic change in America, and then what are the struggles taking place today to vindicate the right to vote and democratic participation. But the questions about campaign finance, I mean, it's a huge subject, and there's so much that can be done. Some of it is being done in different places. There are a lot of jurisdictions, including Montgomery County, Maryland, which is the county that I represent in the U.S. Congress, which has adopted a form of public financing for elections, which saves tons of time for the politicians, so they're not out raising money all of the time. And it's a matching program, so you get lots of small donations, and the rest of it gets matched by the public, by the taxpayers. And it's a way of ousting the influence of big money and big donors. And so that's out there. But of course, the real problem today is the Supreme Court's decision in the Citizens United case. And in Citizens United, the Supreme Court basically transformed every corporate treasury in America into a political slush fund for the CEO and for the executives to decide what they want to do. And that cut against 2 centuries of jurisprudence which defined corporations not as rights-bearing political citizens, but rather as economic instrumentalities. As Chief Justice John Marshall put it in the Dartmouth College versus Woodward case back in the early 1800s, he said, a corporation is an is a artificial entity, invisible, intangible, existing only in contemplation of law and possessing only the rights conferred upon it by the state legislature. And yet this runaway Supreme Court has said that a corporation is basically like a citizen, except it's got a lot more power because they can take all of the money out of the corporate treasury and use it and put it into politics and spend to the heavens on behalf of their political view. And Justice White, in one of the cases about this subject, First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti, he took the opposite view and he said, the corporation is the creature of the state. The state need not permit its own creation to devour it, to consume it. And that's basically where we are today with corporate power.
Hi, Representative Raskin. I'm Ari Citrin. I'm a freshman in the School of Foreign Service. I'm from Montgomery County, Maryland.
Very nice. Where'd you go to high school?
I would have gone to Gaithersburg High School. So
You skipped high school, or?
I went to high school in Michigan.
Oh,
It was
gotcha.
the whole thing. I was also one of your Democracy Summer Fellows 2 summers ago.
Awesome.
So my question is, do you have any advice or ideas on how to fight the political nihilism and pessimism that we've seen spreading that so far, as far as I can tell, has been slightly recently curbed by Vice President Harris's campaign?
What an awesome question. The question is, what do we do to challenge nihilism and pessimism and apathy and cynicism and all of that? Well, the first thing to understand is that's a strategy. Don't kid yourself. If you got to read this amazing book this young man, Christopher Wiley, wrote about working at Cambridge Analytica for Steve Bannon and Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump back in the 2016 election. And the strategy to turn people off to politics, to alienate people, to demoralize people was a very deliberate tactic used in that election. So check that book out. As somebody who says, oh, I'm just so bummed out, all the politicians suck, all the parties are the same, say, congratulations, you're doing the bidding of Vladimir Putin. That's exactly what he wants you to believe. Because I'll tell you one story from that book. They tried to figure out a way to activate Donald Trump's natural base. So they were running these Facebook ads where they were searching for 3 characteristics: psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism, if that sounds familiar to you, okay? And then when people responded and they tested positive for all those, they said those are the people we're going to activate. But then they were testing to try to find people who might have more of a liberal disposition, and then they tried to figure out, how are we going to demoralize these people and turn them off to politics and make them hate Hillary Clinton and the Democrats and so on. So that's number one. Understand that pessimism and apathy are a strategy that somebody's trying to implant in you, usually through the social media. But I think your point at the end is the correct one about what's going on with Kamala Harris's campaign. This is an exciting, open, funny campaign based on music and comedy and community organizing. That's what politics should be about in a democratic society, not a package of lies and not a package of contemptuous slurs on groups of people, right? That takes us away from real democracy. That's what the autocrats and the dictators are doing all over the world, and that's what they're trying to do here. So make democracy fun. And I know you can do it at Georgetown. You guys have a lot of fun at Georgetown. I mean, I see what's going on.
We're running toward the end of our time. Can we take 2 or 3 more
Yeah,
quick
please.
questions?
Okay,
yes.
How come there are no women raising their hands?
This is a good question.
Well, I mean, it's the opposite of every other college and university I go to. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Luke. I'm not used to talking in microphones, that's okay. I'm a freshman in the SFS from DC, and my question for you would be, like, there's recently a kind of infamous battle to pass a spending bill for Ukrainian arms support.
Yes.
So how do you envision, as a member of Congress, the future of Ukrainian support among the U.S.?
Well, I mean, the frontline struggle between the autocrats and the theocrats and the plutocrats and the tyrants and the despots and the dictators on one side, and those defending democracy and freedom on the other, is Ukraine. That's where this is Putin's filthy, imperialist, bloody invasion has been repelled through the courage and the nobility, the honor of the Ukrainians. And I'm proud to say there are a whole lot of us in Congress who've been standing strong with the Ukrainians. But Donald Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, says that he doesn't give a damn about Ukraine and the Ukrainians. And Donald Trump says he'll end the war in one day, although he wouldn't elaborate at the debate when he was asked about that. But there's only one way to end the war in one day, which is to give Russia everything it wants in terms of the territory that it has illegally seized from the independent democratic state of Ukraine, and then continue to cater to Putin and all of his imperial fantasies of becoming, you know, the 21st century's answer to Alexander the Great, you know, a new czar in Russia. So thank you for pointing it out. And we are indebted to the people of Ukraine for doing what they're doing and fighting and making the sacrifices they're making to stop imperial aggression. But, you know, our election is critical to the fortunes of the people in Ukraine, and Ukraine is critical to the fortunes of democracy and freedom on earth.
Kayla.
Hello, Congressman. My name is Kayla Goldrich. I'm a freshman at the School of Foreign Service. I'm also from Gaithersburg, Maryland.
Awesome.
Going back to our conversation about free speech, I was wondering what your thoughts are on government regulating free speech as they do in Germany and Europe. Is that something the United States should pursue or stay away from?
So, Kayla, I don't know if you've got specific things in mind. Of course, government regulation or suppression of free speech. Oh, hate speech. Okay, I'm sorry. Well, again, hate speech, like other forms of controversial speech, is in the eye of the beholder, right? Some people will see a statement that they disagree with as hate speech and fueled by hate. Hate, of course, is an emotion, and the emotion of hate, like love or disgust or envy or jealousy, is legitimate within the field of First Amendment endeavor and expression. On the other hand, you've got to look at what is the social context we're talking about, right? I think everybody would agree that hate speech, you know, racist speech or anti-Semitic speech in an elementary school classroom can clearly be forbidden within our First Amendment system, right? And the same thing in a high school and in a public college classroom. Generally, yes, but again, you know, you've got to look at the specifics. That's what those college presidents got in trouble with Elise Stefanik when they tried to answer according to what the law is. And they should have said what I want to say, which is a university, a college, represents the highest values of our civilization all over the world. And so the universities themselves should be doing everything in their power to end racism and anti-Semitism and other kinds of hate speech.
That's very well put.
You know, but at the same time, we have to accept that students are going to express themselves in a whole bunch of different ways, but they can't do it in a way that's threatening or intimidating or that violates other students' rights. There was some kid at Cornell who said he was going to kill all the Jewish students. Well, that should be immediately investigated. He should be arrested if he's threatening to do that for threatening murder. I mean, and if he goes further, it could be attempted murder. There were some Palestinian kids in Burlington, Vermont, who were shot in Burlington, Vermont, of all cities, right? They were shot. One of them is at Brown still, who's been wounded. I mean, the elementary distinction is between speech and violence. And nobody has a right to engage in violence or violent intimidation or violent threats against other people. And as somebody who's gotten a lot of those, I know that that is tremendously interfering with the actual process of democratic free speech and discussion when people are threatening your life and all that kind of stuff.
Back here. And
Hi, My name is Demetra. I'm a freshman in the College of Arts and Sciences from New York City. And you mentioned earlier in the conversation the Electoral College. And a common argument for the Electoral College is that it gives more power to rural voters who otherwise might not have the opportunity to interface with political candidates. So I was curious, what is your plan for ensuring the protection of the interests of rural voters without the Electoral College?
I mean, I appreciate that. I challenge the premise, however. Think about anybody here from a rural area in New York or California or Michigan, who does the Electoral College benefit today? It's not people from urban states or rural states, big states or small states. It's people from swing states, right? There are 7 swing states. And how do you define a swing state? It's a state where there's roughly equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans, right? So I've got lots of rural voters who live in the state of Maryland, on the Eastern Shore in Western Maryland. Do people go and campaign there and try to appeal to them? No, because they know that Maryland is a safe blue state. And it's the same with the safe red state, like Texas or Mississippi or Alabama. A lot of rural areas there, they don't benefit. Montana, Idaho, safe red states. Alaska, they're not people spending any money setting up campaign offices or running TV ads or anything there. They go to Pennsylvania and Michigan, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina now is in play. That's just random, right? So I think that is a misnomer, the idea that rural voters are somehow advantaged by the Electoral College. They're not. We have, I think that the congressional districting system today protects a lot of rural voters because there's lots of rural districts where people are getting elected, and those people are standing strong for farm interests, although the Farm Bill tends to benefit large agribusiness interests, not small farmers, who of course are now like less than 2% or around 1% of the public. But I think that the protection of the interests of rural voters is really important. My district used to have Carroll County, Maryland, and Frederick County, Maryland, which had a lot of rural voters, and I was really proud that in the Infrastructure Act, which we passed when President Biden took over, we had a $1.2 trillion investment in the bridges and the roads and the highways, the ports and the airports, but also in rural broadband. And we've made great gains in terms of rural broadband. It's very hard if you're in a rural community to be connected to the economy and to have an effective small business if you don't have access to the internet.
Back here, John, Allie.
Hi, my name is Allie, and I'm also from Maryland. My question for you actually has to do with the free speech class that I'm taking with Professor Ungar, and it's kind of building off of Kayla's question. So in class, we've discussed a lot of philosophers that believe that the idea of free speech is to find a common truth, or to promote a marketplace of ideas, or to protect the rights of other people to their own free speech and beliefs. So I wanted to ask you, under what you said about hate laws or hate speech laws and things like that, where do you think the democratic ideals of free speech in the US have their end goal, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Well, the idea of free speech is closely intertwined with democracy itself. You can't have meaningful democratic institutions and democratic culture in life if people can't express themselves. And that includes the right to be wrong, the right to contradict other people, the right to be contradicted, the right to put your ideas out there. Now, when you look at January 6th, for example, some people said, well, when the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the Ku Klux Klan and the MAGA mob stormed the Capitol and wounded and injured 140 officers, hospitalizing many of them, and drove the members of the House and the Senate out of their chambers and nearly overthrew the Constitution, that was just an expression of speech. But here's where I return to the speech conduct distinction. I mean, you've got a right to stand up and say, despite all the evidence, despite all the court opinions, I think that Donald Trump won the election and it's being stolen from him. Fine, you can say that. But the minute you start beating up police officers and interfering with a government proceeding and trying to overthrow the Constitution, you've crossed over from speech to conduct. And I think that's where we draw the line. Incidentally, that was not just conduct that resulted in violence. It was conduct designed to overthrow the democratic process, which free speech is designed to promote and to advance, right? So we just had a presidential election that had gone on for more than a year with primaries and debates and people participating, and it was over, right? We had the election, and then they wanted to use violence and deceit and subterfuge to try to just declare Donald Trump the winner. That was an assault on free speech. That was an assault on the First Amendment. It was an assault on the entire Constitution. And, you know, in the Greek sense, a tyrant is somebody who arises from outside of the constitutional order and tries to destroy the constitutional order, claiming to be the champion of the people. And the founders had a very clear idea about that. If you read Federalist Number 1 by Alexander Hamilton, he said what we needed to fear was politicians who begin as demagogues, pandering to the negative emotions of the crowd, and end up as tyrants, violating the freedoms and liberties of the people, which is why I said at the second impeachment trial, Donald Trump doesn't know a lot about the founders, but they knew a lot about him. and they really did.
One last question.
We could take a few more. I don't wanna,
okay.
Some of these people are my constituents. I don't want to offend them.
That's
you know?
right. Yeah, we loaded it with your constituents today, Jimmy.
Hi, Congressman. I'm Axel Tapia in the School of Foreign Service from Jakarta, Indonesia. Indonesia is the third largest democracy, and we looked up to countries like the United States when it comes to our democratic practices. But when we're seeing the democratic ideals in the United States, where elections are filled with sometimes lies, political violence, and other atrocities, what kind of signal does that send about American democratic leadership in the world? And
Well,
globally?
what do you think? It sounds like you've got a thought on that.
Well, I just thought that democracy should be there's no single template to a democracy. It should be embedded within our cultural practices.
Yes.
But I just want to hear your feedback.
So, I mean, my response to it is that democracy is not just a static collection of institutional practices. It's partly that. It's elections, it's freedom of press, and so on. But democracy is always an unfinished project. It's a process in motion, right? So I would never try to hold up America as the perfect democracy. We began as a slave republic of white male property owners over age 21. But through successive waves of social and political struggle and constitutional amendment, we've gotten much closer to becoming Lincoln's beautiful vision of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. If you look at all the constitutional amendments we've had since the original Bill of Rights, the vast majority of them have been democratizing pro-suffrage amendments, right? So the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment gave us equal protection and due process. The 15th Amendment banned race discrimination in voting. The 17th Amendment shifted the mode of election of U.S. senators from the legislatures to the people. The 19th Amendment gave us women's suffrage, doubling the franchise in America. The 23rd Amendment gave people here in D.C. at least the right to vote in presidential elections. The 24th Amendment banned poll taxes in elections. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. So the whole trajectory of American historical progress and constitutional development has been towards greater democracy. But Tocqueville observed in Democracy in America that democracy and voting rights are always contested. There are always people trying to push in the other direction. We've been living through a contractionary period with voter suppression laws. After Shelby County versus Holder, there have been more than 100 laws passed around the country, making it more difficult to register, making it more difficult to vote, closing polling places, consolidating polling places, making it harder to get to a polling place, and so on. So we got to get back on the growth track in terms of democracy. And a great place to start is right here in Washington, D.C. It's the only national capital on planet Earth where the people are not represented in their own federal legislature. We got 713,000 tax-paying draftable citizens who live in your city who are not represented in the House or the Senate. In the 117th Congress, it was my honor to be one of the floor leaders with Eleanor Holmes Norton on the DC state legislation. And when we started out, I got up and I thanked the people of Washington. I said, you have a bona fide, verifiable political grievance. And yet you didn't come down here and beat the daylights out of our police officers and hospitalize people and shut down the Congress and try to overturn an election. You did it the right way. You had a statehood convention. You've petitioned for admission to the Union, like the last 37 states petitioned for admission to the Union. And people said, that one's too big, that one's too small. Alaska and Hawaii, they're not contiguous. Texas used to be its own state. There's too much polygamy in Utah. All of these things, right? And all of those objections were overridden because of the historical and constitutional imperative of consent of the governed, as Jefferson put it in the Declaration, allowing people who are part of the country to govern themselves and to participate in national government. So we need DC statehood. We need statehood for 3.5 million Americans living in Puerto Rico. It is time for us to get rid of the Electoral College and to have a national popular vote for president. We've got to move to ranked choice voting so that every winner in every congressional election is a majority winner. And you don't win with 33% of the vote, but you've got to get 50% plus one in order to win. And that dramatically reduces negative politics too. So there are reforms that we can make by studying our own history and by studying the experience of other countries. You know, we spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year promoting democracy to fledgling democracies around the world. And they're writing constitutions. And the one thing they never come back to us with is, you know that electoral college thing you have? That's really interesting. We think we'll import it to our country, right? The world has left that behind. So Jefferson said he deplored the sanctimonious reverence with which people regarded the original handiwork of the framers. He said, I admire that generation. I was part of that generation, but they're not wiser than future generations. And we've got one thing they don't have, which is the experience of how things have worked out in the meantime. So every U.S. citizen has got to think of himself or herself as a constitutional founder. What are we doing with our Constitution? What are we doing to defend it, to strengthen it, to make it work, and to continue to expand the process of democratic freedom?
Hello. Thank you so much for coming here and talking with us today. I'm a graduate. My name is Caroline. I'm a graduate student in the Security Studies program here at Georgetown. And I think in recent years, we've really seen a wave of nationalism and authoritarianism kind of like wash over the globe. And my question was, what is your advice for students who want to get involved in the fight to save our democracy? And what are some tangible steps we can take to, fight jingoism and these narratives of hate that are becoming all increasingly common in our society?
Question.
Yeah, I appreciate the question very much. I spoke to some students at GW who were very stressed out about what was going on. And they asked me the question, what should we do? And the first thing I said was, I'll give you the advice I give to the little kids in soccer. Don't bunch, okay? Not everybody needs to live in Berkeley or Brooklyn or DuPont Circle. Like, go back to where you're from. If you come from Georgia or North Carolina or South Dakota or Michigan, go there and organize, Go there and be part of the process of advancing democracy and freedom. And so I feel strongly about that. But, it's a very personal, existential question where you should go and what you should do to be part of this process. But I think you've correctly identified the stakes. When President Biden used to come over to the Democratic caucus, he would say every time he spoke to these leaders of the countries you're talking about, to the Putins and the Orbans and the El-Sisis and the Erdogans and so on, they would say, Joe Biden, you're a very nice man. You're a kind man. But democracy doesn't work anymore because of the speed of the internet, because of climate change, which they acknowledge behind closed doors, although the autocrats deny it in public. There's too much chaos, there's too much confusion. We need strong men, we need dictators. And they mean that. And they're working very actively to install strong men and dictators in America. So we've got to stand very tough for democratic freedom in our country and around the world. And there are people all over the world depending on America to stand strong. So I think you'll be able to figure out the best place to go, but don't do it alone. Bring your friends with you. Make sure you're paying attention to your own health and your own happiness. That's really important. It's a tough time to be a young person. I mean, these guys are dealing with issues that we never dealt with, Sandy, growing up. I mean, to think about climate change as a reality, and I know so many young people ask about the ethics of bringing children into the world with climate change where it is, and with all the political polarization and the division and the authoritarianism, COVID, and they've had a tough time. So pay equal attention to what your own needs are. But I do agree that being politically engaged is going to be part of the solution for you, because you've got to connect with other people who are going through what you're going through. And there are great musicians and actors and cultural performers in your generation who are on your side, like the great Taylor Swift.
Hi, my name is Ryan. I'm a freshman in the School of Foreign Service from Miami, Florida. So you have been involved, of course, in President Trump's impeachment, which got, I believe, the most bipartisan vote in both the Senate and the House for a presidential impeachment. However, it still fell 10 votes short of a conviction. Do you think that with the increasing politicization of the judicial confirmation process and polarization in Congress, is impeachment falling antiquated as a check and balance?
So it's a great question. I mean, it's hard to see impeachment falling away. It's in the Constitution, of course, and the Republicans have tried to use it multiple times in this Congress against President Biden, against Secretary Mayorkas, and so on. They've fallen flat on their face in all of these efforts, because impeachment is not something that was meant to be used in some kind of reciprocal tit-for-tat way. One person commits high crimes and misdemeanors and gets impeached, and so they get mad and say, well, impeach the next person, regardless of what they've done. So that clearly doesn't work. The 2/3 threshold is a tall hill to climb. Every senator was not just a judge and a juror in the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump. They were witnesses, and in some sense, they were victims of the crime itself. And if we can't get a bipartisan vote at that point to stand up for basic constitutional values, it seems like it's going to be very tough to do that. It looks like we've elevated partisanship above everything else. And, I'll give you my little take on partisanship, which I discussed some at the impeachment trial. But the mistake is to categorically condemn partisanship. I think that's just stupid. I mean, partisanship is a reflection of people belonging to parties and having strong views and having a program for the country. There's no problem with that. That's a reflection of the openness of our political system. If you want to get rid of partisanship, there's an easy way to do it. Do what Vladimir Putin did. Just get rid of the political parties. If you move to a one-party state, you don't have excessive partisanship and all this stuff the pundits are always talking about. So I'm not somebody who just blithely denounces partisanship, okay? The problem is that people are not willing to recognize what its benefits are, and it helps to articulate programs and political conflict, helps to mobilize the electorate. It gives oxygen to people's political participation. But I will say this, once the election is over, those of us who aspire and attain to public office have got to remember what a party is. The word party comes from the French word parti, a part. Your party is just part of the whole. And we have to do whatever we can to try to represent the whole, knowing that there's going to be differences of opinion about different issues, but you've got to try and do that. And that's what I said to the senators. I said, we know how to be nonpartisan when we want to be. Think about our constituent offices. If you come to my constituent office out in beautiful Rockville, Maryland, and you got a problem with Medicare or Medicaid or Social Security or your passport or visa or whatever, we will go to bat for you. And we don't ask, are you a Democrat? Are you a Republican? Are you libertarian? Are you green? Are you independent? We just go to fight for you as long as you're my constituent. And then there are some people who are not constituents who come in looking for help. But that's a different issue. But it's the same thing for the senators in an impeachment trial, right? They'd already sworn an oath of office to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. They swore another oath to render impartial justice. And the word impartial closely resembles nonpartisan. And I feel like a number of the people, including Mitch McConnell, betrayed that oath. McConnell got up and made a speech afterwards, and he said the House managers had made their case. Donald Trump was singularly, factually, ethically responsible for everything that happened on that day. But, he said, the Senate lacked jurisdiction to conduct a trial of a former president, which cut against 2 centuries of understanding that no, you can't escape impeachment by the House and conviction by the Senate just by quickly resigning and then running for your office again. And moreover, we dealt with that on the first day of the trial. They had a motion to dismiss on grounds that there was no jurisdiction. That was rejected 56-44. So he went back to a legal point, which was rejected on the first day, in order to decide the factual question, which makes this, I would argue, perhaps the greatest case of jury nullification in American history. And he stated it when he got up, that he thought that Trump was actually guilty, but there wasn't jurisdiction to try him. So everybody kicked the can down the road. The Senate didn't want to deal with the reality of this constitutional crime. The Republican Party didn't want to deal with the reality of this constitutional crime. The Supreme Court didn't want to deal with the reality of this constitutional crime. But you know who's going to confront it? The people are in November. And ultimately, that's why I place my faith in the people to be the great constitutional patriots here.
Okay, last question. I'm told you have a phone call that you have to take pretty soon. So.
All right. Hi, sorry. My name is Ashley. I'm a freshman in the School of Nursing, so definitely not in this area, but I love to take part in the legislative aspect of healthcare. But my question is in regards to the conflict of Israel and Palestine. And I feel like as America, we kind of inherited the idea of being the policeman of the world. And to an extent, that can be as large or small scale. And how do you think that defines our role in global conflicts like what's going on in Gaza? And how do you think the political aspect of what's going on as the election comes up, how does that affect the morality of what we should be doing versus which voter base we're appealing to?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that America's best role is to be a champion and an ally for people seeking democratic freedom and human rights and their own national sovereignty and their own national security all over the world. And you obviously bring up the most complicated and vexed region of the world in our last 30 seconds here. But I think that America under President Biden's leadership and Vice President Harris's has been on the side of and should be on the side of trying to bring that conflict to a quick resolution by a return of all of the hostages that have been taken by Hamas and the imposition of an immediate regional ceasefire and the surging of aid to the suffering population in Gaza. And we've got to break those cycles of violence and terror and war that have caused so much misery for people on all sides of the conflict there.
Jamie, thank you. Not surprisingly, this time with you has been very well spent, and I appreciate your taking this time at Georgetown.
Well, the pleasure is all mine, Professor Ungar, or Dean Ungar. Are you a dean now?
No,
President.
I'm just a professor.
You have so many titles, but thank you for introducing me to your students and inviting me to your beautiful campus. And yeah, thanks to Georgetown. Hang tough, everybody. Hang tough for democracy.